I'm not a fan of themed Sundays. I may have mentioned that 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 times over the course of my ministry here. But when we were planning services for the fall, and I saw that I'd be leading the service of Columbus Day weekend, Mark suggested that I go with the theme of discovery. And this was very appealing to me, because I realized that exploration, investigation, and discovery of new ideas, both spiritual and otherwise, is one of the main reasons, perhaps the main reason, that I choose to be a Unitarian Universalist. Our third president, Thomas Jefferson, once wrote, "Were I to be the founder of a new sect, I would call them apiarians, and after the example of the bee, advise them to extract the honey of every sect." And so I'd like you to imagine yourselves as bees, or if that's a little creepy, members of a crew on a voyage of discovery this morning. As our flower garden or map, I'm going to be using the symbols in the back. I'm going to start from the outside and work our way toward the middle, but you don't have to turn your necks around. I've got pictures up here. And I'm going to share discoveries of new ways of thinking inspired by the religious traditions represented there. These are certainly not meant to be all-inclusive, but rather insights that you may not have thought of before. Discoveries, if you will. This is the yin-yang symbol of Taoism. Through the practice of Tao, also known as the Way, peace and tranquility overcome worry. Taoist philosophy contends that worry has nothing to do with the outside world. It is simply a product of the imagination during obsession about worst-case scenarios, like a global pandemic. Practicing Tao, or going with the flow, it's the easiest way I can sum it up, gives adherents the tools to live in the present, free from many of the harmful effects of worrying and anxiety. Taoism can best be described as like a willow tree. Rather than standing erect and resolute against the winds like an old oak tree, the willow bends and goes with the wind, just as Taoists try to go with the gentle flow of the universe. There's an expression, in life, pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional. Siddhartha Gautama, the man who would become the Buddha or the Enlightened One, would almost certainly have agreed with that sentiment. Buddhism is arguably more of a philosophy than a religion. There is no supreme being and no savior. Each person is responsible for his or her own enlightenment. The symbol of Buddhism is a wheel with 8 spokes. These represent the Noble Eightfold Path, which is a way to minimize the suffering in life. The path consists of the following elements. These would be each of the spokes. Right view, right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right diligence, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The Buddha did not consider himself to be divine. Rather, he said that anyone could become enlightened. Anyone could become a Buddha. You may have seen this in travel brochures and so forth. This is a torii, and it is a gateway through which gods and all others enter the Jinga, or sacred space, in Shinto, which is the only religion native to the Japanese islands. Shintoism has no founder. It began in small villages throughout the Japanese islands, growing over time. The gods of Shintoism range from ancestors of the family, people who died a tragic death or made a great achievement to the world, ancient gods from old texts, a region, nature itself, the weather, terrain, and so on. It can be an actual person or a geographical thing or a natural phenomenon. In fact, there are so many gods in Shintoism that there's a phrase called Yazorozushu no Komi. Yazorozushu means 8 million. So 8 million gods, goddesses, and so forth. Figure of speech. Happiness and prosperity can be gained by welcoming the gods and receiving their blessing. They actually have festivals where they will acknowledge and celebrate, and then, best part, they believe that their gods want them to celebrate and be happy, so they have these big raucous festivals. This is the symbol for Om, and it is the sacred sound of the universe in Hinduism. In the Western world in which we live, we think of creation beginning with light, the Big Bang. For Hindus, it began with sound. God basically spoke, and the creation sprang forth. Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world, and its sacred text, the Rig Veda, is the oldest known book. There is a misconception that Hindus worship many gods and goddesses, but it's more complicated than that. Hindus' word for God is Brahman, and all divine beings are different aspects of the one God. In fact, Hindus believe that a part of Brahman exists in every living thing. So we all have aspects of Brahman, or God, within us. We tend to think of time in our culture as a linear progression of past to present to future. But in the Hindu worldview, time is a circle. There are all these cycles throughout the ages, where the past, the present, and the future actually happen all at once. Reincarnation is a prominent belief. Salvation occurs when spiritual enlightenment is achieved, which ends the cycle of reincarnation. This is the star and crescent moon of Islam. Islam gets a bad rap in our post-9/11 world. But like any religion, unfortunately, it has its extremists. Islam literally means to willingly submit to God. Muslims call God Allah, though they see him as the same God worshipped by Jews and Christians. When we think of Muslims, we probably picture Arabs, though only 15% of the world's Muslims are in fact Arabs. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world and the second largest. By mid-century, it will be the largest. One thing I found interesting is there are no original copies of the Jewish Torah or the Christian Bible, but the Quran, or the Islamic holy book, still exists in its original form. It is also known as the Recitation and is believed to have been dictated to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel. There's also misunderstanding of the word jihad, which we think of as meaning holy war. But there is no such translation in Islam. The word jihad simply means to strive or to struggle. Anyone who strives or struggles against something in the name of God could be taking part in a jihad. For example, a scientist searching for a cure to cancer or coronavirus could declare a jihad against it. Despite Western perceptions, Islam traditionally teaches tolerance of other religions, especially Judaism and Christianity, since all three derive from the prophet Abraham. For example, in the 2nd chapter of the Quran, it says, "Surely those who believe, and those who are Jews, and the Christians, and the Sabians," that's another group of people on the Arabian Peninsula, "whoever believes in God and the last day and does good, they shall have their reward from their Lord. and there will be no fear for them, nor shall they grieve. This is the thunderbird, a symbol of Native American spirituality. With over 500 recognized tribes, there are many different beliefs, but if there is any commonality, it is living in harmony with the natural world. Whereas much of humanity sees the world as something to be brought under control and subdued, Native Americans tend to see it as something we have an obligation to. Nature is something that we are a part of, not separate. This is more important now than ever with our environment straining under the weight of our generations of neglect and abuse. The words of Chief Seattle ring true. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors. We borrow it from our children. For our exploration of Judaism, I'd like to talk about the story of Adam and Eve. Many of us learned, perhaps in Sunday school, that it's the tale of the first man and the first woman in original sin. Satan tempts them, they eat the apple, they get kicked out of paradise. Except there's no Satan in this story, only a serpent. Apples did not grow in the ancient Near East. The story doesn't specify the type of fruit, though it's funny, if you ask people, they'll say, oh, the apple, but it just says the fruit of the tree of knowledge. So it was more likely, in that region, a fig or a pomegranate. And the word sin does not occur in the Hebrew Bible until chapter 4. The concept of the devil wasn't invented until the 1st century BC, which was 500 to 700 years after the Genesis story was most likely written. An original sin was an idea first put forward by Bishop Irenaeus of Gaul in the 2nd century AD. So from the time of the story of Adam and Eve being written, it was 5 to 7 centuries before there was any talk of a devil, and another 2 centuries before the idea of original sin came along. When we keep those facts in mind, when we look at the Jewish scriptures through a Jewish lens, as it were, the story of Adam and Eve is a myth about a man created to tend the garden of a divine being, a woman created to be the man's companion, and a talking snake who tempts the woman to eat fruit from a magical tree of knowledge declared off limits by the being who created it all. This is a story about a woman disobeying her creator for the purpose of gaining wisdom. Eve is, in effect, the protagonist who moves the story and subsequent history of humanity forward. At her instigation, and with the guidance of a serpent, the humans trade a life of ignorance and potentially immortality as God's gardeners for a taste of divine knowledge. It's a different perspective to a familiar story. And I didn't want this to be too long, but if you want to hear about Adam's first wife, there is a tradition in the Jewish teachings. See me after church. It's really fascinating. This is arguably the most recognized symbol in the world. It is the Latin cross and, of course, representative of Christianity. This church honors many religious and spiritual traditions, but it exists because of Christianity, which is tied to the origins of both Unitarianism and Universalism. You may or may not consider yourself to be a Christian, but there's no getting around the fact that you wouldn't be sitting here and I wouldn't be standing up here if not for the works of 2 men. The first is Yeshua, a Hebrew rabbi and reformer, better known by the Greek translation of his name, Jesus. He set out to reform the Jewish faith and bring about what he called the kingdom of God. He was said to have performed miracles and have been the Messiah foretold in the Jewish scriptures. And when he was executed for his efforts, his followers told of his resurrection. Those followers continued his work, and perhaps most importantly among them was the second man, Paul of Tarsus. Paul had begun as a militant persecutor of Christians. But when he converted to Christianity, he became one of its most fervent supporters. Unlike most Christians, Paul was a Roman citizen. And that was important because it meant that he had certain rights and privileges under the law. The Jewish followers of Jesus that were not Roman citizens had no such rights. So if they got a little rowdy or rebellious, Rome could just... But Paul, being a citizen, he had certain rights. They couldn't just dispatch him. And he took Jesus' teachings and spread them, not just among his fellow Jews, but also to the Gentiles. He taught that the Christian message of love and forgiveness was for all people. And that is the heart of traditional universalism. And so it is probably no coincidence that the people who founded this church chose St. Paul when they named it. And that brings us to the end of our brief voyage of discovery, at least for today. Our faith not only allows us to look at different perspectives, it actively encourages it. So set out, explore, wonder, and remember that sometimes the journey itself is the destination.